This is the new Gen 3 Tyson Mguffin 14mm Magnus Paddle, said to be one of the most powerful paddles out of the entire Gen 3 lineup, and maybe even one of the most powerful paddles on the entire market. That said, there are a few things you should know before you consider buying this. Anyways, please consider subscribing if any of this is helpful, and let's jump into things. All right, let's go for specs. This is specifically the 14mm Magnus, a $280 paddle that has a listed average weight of 7.9 ounces, a paddle length of 16.5 inches, a paddle width of 7.5 inches, a grip length of 5 inches, and a grip circumference of 4.1875 inches. Very specific. Now, out of these specs, I'd say the most notable one here is probably the grip length, as it intentionally has a much shorter handle than most paddles. It's also worth noting that the actual area where you can actually grip on the handle is closer to about 4.25 inches rather than the listed 5 inches. This paddle really is intended for people who only use one hand, but it's worth being said, you can still make it work with two hands. You'll probably have to stack your hands slightly, but let it be known, it's not a complete deal breaker if you're specifically a two-handed backhand player like me. Granted, I do have small hands. This paddle also has a bit longer of face, which is actually pretty nice, but I'll get into that in a bit. Now, since this is a part of the Gen 3 collection, it of course also comes with the NFC chip where you can register your paddle, and the new propulsion core technology, which I'm sure you've already heard plenty about by now, but if you haven't already, please check out my Perseus paddle review where I dive a bit deeper into it. Long story short, the propulsion core is supposed to make it hit harder. Anyways, let's move on to what really matters here, the feel in the gameplay of the paddle. All right, starting off with power. Now, without beating around the bush, this is by far the most powerful paddle out of the Gen 3 collection, a collection literally made of power paddles, and maybe, just maybe, the most powerful paddle on the market currently. I've played with the Black Diamond Power, I've played with the Gearbox Pro, and in my opinion, the 14mm Magnus hits just as hard, if not harder than them. It's pretty freaking close, but either way, it is powerful. I mean, when I picked up this thing for the first time and started hitting with it, all I wanted to do was just drive because I felt like I could. Drives with this thing are insane. My playstyle doesn't even revolve around driving anymore, but this paddle made it feel like I could just straight up win points with the power I got from it alone. And I usually don't get that feeling. Plus, at least for me, it just physically and immediately felt comfortable to hit hard with and hit with in general, which just isn't always the case with a lot of paddles like the Perseus, for example. Serves are of course also extremely deadly with this as well, and it makes it really hard to get a solid return on. And if you have any pace to your serves already, you'll probably win a lot of points with just your serves alone using this paddle. Another area where this paddle shines as well are speed ups. Even though it is a pretty standard weight for most paddles, in hand it just feels a lot lighter and easier to maneuver. So especially with the 14mm, you can really snap this paddle in a moment's notice, making speed ups absolutely insane. Like, I'm not even exaggerating when I say it's almost borderline unfair due to how fast this paddle lets you speed it up at people, giving you almost no time to react, to the point where I'm starting to understand why more and more people are using some kind of eyewear protection when they play. It's this paddle. This is the reason why. It's seriously probably one of the only paddles that I'm actually afraid of getting hit with. It's that fast, and I think a part of that is actually due to the propulsion core. Now, while this paddle is powerful, I'd say this thing doesn't actually have as much pop as some of the other Gen 3 paddles. That said, that is comparing it to the other Gen 3s specifically. Compared to any other paddle, this thing will pop an insane amount, which will take some time to get used to. Overall though, on sheer power alone, I would give this a solid 9.5 out of 10. All right, moving on to control. Now, this is where I think most people would assume this paddle falls off a lot, and rightfully so, because one, the Gen 3 power paddles themselves haven't exactly been known so far to have great control, which is very true. And two, 14mm typically don't have the best control either. But to my surprise, the 14mm Magnus isn't actually that bad when it comes to control. Now, is this going to compare to an actual 16mm control paddle? Hell no. But the main difference is I actually feel like I have the potential to consistently control the ball with this paddle, which is a huge win for the Gen 3 paddles, because let me tell you, the propulsion core is great for power, but when it comes to control, it kind of fucks things up. And it's for that exact reason that I actually think when it comes specifically to the Gen 3 Joolas, the 14mm are actually easier to control than the 16mm, strictly due to the propulsion core. From my experience so far, the thicker 16mm paddles actually allow the propulsion core inside to have a greater effect, giving the ball way more pop, while the thinner 14mm paddle doesn't have as much room in between, which doesn't allow for the propulsion core to take as big of an effect, and thus it doesn't allow it to pop as much. Think of it like a trampoline on the ground. If you throw a ball against a trampoline that has more room between it and the ground, it's going to pop up a lot harder than a ball that bounces off a trampoline closer to the ground, because the higher trampoline has more time to absorb it and shoot it back up. Anyways, it's because of this that the 14mm seems to actually be a bit more predictable and ultimately just feels a bit more easier to control. And this goes for drops, For dinks, honestly everything. For drops, it felt like it could actually guide the ball into the kitchen with a bit of adjusting. It doesn't hug the ball like a control paddle would, but it also doesn't fly off the face of it, making it impossible to predict like one of these 16mm paddles. Dinks felt fairly comfortable as well. It wasn't my favorite paddle to dink with, but definitely something I could get used to with time. Like even after just the first few uses, I could immediately start to adjust to it and get fairly comfortable with controlling the ball, which definitely wasn't the case with the 16mm Perseus. Now something else to note is that there will definitely be a break-in period with this paddle, but honestly it wasn't as bad as some of the other paddles. Like it took some time to get used to the power and pop. I definitely hit a lot of balls out of bounds, but it was pretty easy to start dialing things in. Much easier than with some of the other Gen 3s. I've also heard that similar to some other paddles, the Magnus warms up the more you play with it, which after a few weeks I didn't see a huge difference, but it could be true the longer you go. Overall for control, I would give it a solid 6.5 out of 10. Alright, now let's talk spin, probably one of the most underrated parts of this paddle. Now you may have heard some rumors going around about the insane grit on some of these Gen 3 paddles, and well, let me start by saying that those rumors are true and the Magnus is a part of those said paddles. The grit on this thing is absolutely ridiculous, and like some other reviewers found, it was so crazy that when it was first unboxed, it actually stuck to my shirt, and it still kind of does a little, but the grit has worn down slightly. Still, the amount of spin you can generate with this paddle is in a league of its own. I've seen shots done with this paddle that should 1000% have been out of bounds, but literally did a rainbow due to the top spin generated and then came back in. It's almost magical in a scary way. Now combine the spin with the power this thing has, drive, serves, any baseline shots are even more ridiculous, and this combination is what I think puts it over the top of any other power paddles when it comes to power. Especially on drives, the top spin really allows you to hit those low knee height spots, making it extremely hard to defend because you either just miss the ball completely or are forced to pop it straight up when blocking. Now obviously I don't know how long the grit will last, probably not a long time, but I will say that it's held up fairly well so far. Still, what I do know right now is that the spin on it is absolutely ridiculous, and for that I would give spin on this paddle a 9 out of 10. A quick side note though, it's worth pointing out that there have been some inconsistencies with the grit in some paddles, and even just some of the sides having more grit than others, so just be on the lookout for that too. Alright, moving on to sweet spot. So overall, the sweet spot is actually a lot better than I expected. Much better than a lot of the other Gen 3 paddles. In fact, I think the shorter handle and longer face combined with it being 14mm actually helps make that sweet spot a bit larger than maybe even some of your average paddles. So overall, really not bad. Now lastly, here are some cons of this paddles and my final thoughts. First off, obviously, handle size could be a con for you. Yes, you can fit a two-handed backhand if you have small hands, but it definitely won't be as comfortable as using a normal sized handle. Other than that though, this paddle surprisingly doesn't have near as many cons as some of the other Gen 3 paddles. For example, sound was a big deal with the 16mm versions just because of how hollow and empty and gross they sounded, but the 14mm versions don't actually sound near as bad just because it's literally not as hollow. It actually sounds more like a normal paddle. Like it still sounds a little weird and slightly like a toy, but not near as bad as the 16mm Gen 3s. The other big con that has been brought up recently is the core crushing problem. In case you weren't aware, some people have been experiencing core crushing issues already with their Gen 3 paddles, which honestly doesn't surprise me too much. I would guess the 14mm are a bit more reliable because they are less hollow and they just feel more sturdy, but again, that is just an assumption. Still, this reason alone could and should make you cautious on purchasing this paddle or any of the Gen 3 paddles for that matter. There's a lot of information we don't have yet on this, but it is an ongoing issue that you should definitely take into consideration. Still, on that note, my main takeaway is if you are serious still about getting the Magnus paddle, get the 14mm version, because one, it just feels way sturdier and probably more reliable than the 16mm version. Two, I think the 14mm is actually easier to control with, which is usually one of the cons. And three, the 16mm just sounds so much worse. Like, I can't say it enough, the 16mm versions actually felt and sounded like a toy, but the 14mm feels a lot more solid and are just realistically much more believable that it is a $280 paddle. It's still insane, but it's more realistic. I didn't really get to test the 16mm Magnus too much, but the only real advantage I saw to it was it had a bit more pop, and that was it. Other than that though, if you forget about the potential core crushing issue, this is probably one of the only Gen 3 paddles that I've tested so far I would confidently recommend to people. In fact, if you're going to get any Gen 3 paddle at all, I would specifically recommend this one because, let's face it, the main reason people are interested in the Gen 3s in the first place is for the power, and this paddle has that power and then some, along with some control you can actually manage. Specifically, see this paddle being good for either high level players who already have a pretty good grasp on control already, or honestly people who just like to drive inner bangers, because that is literally what this paddle is all about. People might not like playing against it, but that's what this paddle does best. I could also see this paddle being hands down one of the best paddles for singles, because let's face it, this thing has the power, the spin, really all you need for a good singles paddle. The real question though is, are you willing to cough up $280 for it? All right, that is it. Thanks so much for watching. If any of this was helpful, please consider subscribing, and I will see you next time.